Hi, welcome back to Engine Shop Joe. This is the midweek special, kind of like the midnight special used to be. And I'm here to answer a question that someone posted about an ISX CM870 that randomly lopes at idle when they stop, like at a traffic light. And they said sometimes if they tap the throttle pedal, it'll go away. Sometimes it comes right back. Sometimes it'll be loping, they drive to the next light, and then it idles fine there. So it's been doing this about a year. So I'm going to go through and list the things that can cause that. So when we start out on the ISX, it's important to know how the fuel system worked on those old engines. And the old engines, by old engines, I mean the old fuel systems, which is non-common rail. The injectors are driven by rocker arms, and the fuel is metered through an actuator. And the actuator is just a precision metering solenoid. The injectors were timed with a timing actuator, and the fuel that made horsepower that went into the cup that got injected in the cylinder came from the metering actuator. In the head, the fuel systems are separate for cylinder 1, 2, 3, and then cylinder 4, 5, 6. That's why there's a timing and a metering for the front bank. 1, 2, 3 is the front bank. And then for the rear bank, there's another set. The ECM, I was told by an engineer, thinks it's running two separate engines, and it tried to make them run smoothly together. And they had some real struggles with the software early on with rough idle and lope at idle. So if all the injectors are firing perfectly and all the fuel's being metered perfectly, the engine will run very smooth at idle. What happens is as things wear, if we start getting a cylinder that fires a little heavy, in other words, one injector fires a little more fuel than at idle, the engine will speed up 15, 20 RPM. We don't even notice that, but the ECM sees it, and it doesn't like it. And so what it'll do is it'll shut the next cylinder off in the firing order. Well, so cylinder number 1 is in the front bank. The next in firing order is 5. That's in the rear bank. So it'll shut 5 off. If 1 hit hard enough, it'll shut off 5 and 3. And then if the RPM's a little too low when it's time to fire 6, 6 will fire a little heavier. And then what will happen is the engine will get into a lope pattern because the software is not able to straighten the idle out because we're metering such a small amount of fuel at idle, especially when it's hot. And there's not a lot of parasitic loads like heavy alternator load from fans on high, all the lights on at night, AC compressor on, the clutches on, that kind of a thing. When I say fans, I meant in the cab and in the bunk, the electric fans. So that's what can cause that rough idle. Now, there's some other things that can cause the engine to have the rough idle. I mentioned the metering and wear and the metering and timing actuators. The injectors can have a problem with what's called a ball check. I will put some slides up and talk about that in a few minutes. If the overhead has not been set in 250,000 miles, you may need to run some injector flush through your fuel for a full tank load and then have the overhead set. If the injectors are more than 1/4 turn loose, you torque them into the cups when you set them. If they're more than 1/4 turn loose, from where you start to where you're finished, that can affect running, I was told by an engineer many years ago. If the injectors have over 250,000 miles on them and have not been set, you may have slack on your timing plunger. So then you need to go in and spray basically brake clean or solvent on top of the injectors inside the spring, soak that area on each injector and let it sit about 10 minutes to loosen the varnish ring on the timing plungers. Or when you set the overhead, if you tighten it up, everything moves down farther in and the timing plunger will move down into the timing barrel. They're precision fit, and that little ring of varnish will lock it. And then that cylinder doesn't fire anymore. So either take the injector apart and free it up, or you replace the injector. Some guys throw a couple cans of ATF in each tank. I'm talking about like 100-gallon, 200 gallons total capacity, and they'll put 2 cans of ATF in one tank and 2 in the other, and your injector cleaner. You can do that if you do not have after treatment. If you have after treatment, do not put ATF in your fuel tanks because you will ruin your after treatment. Only put additives in your fuel tank that are approved by Cummins if you have after treatment. And that's another subject of another video. But anyway, so you do the injector flush, get the overhead set if it hasn't been set. To find out if it's a ball check, we're going to see some slides in a second. If your calibration is a very early revision, and if you're not sure what that means, find out what the ECM code is that's actually in the ECM. Someone's got to hook up with a scanner. It's going to be 1 or 2 letters, some digits, a period, and 2 more digits. I need to know all of that. And I can look at calibration revisions and see if there was a fix for better idle, because just updating the calibration doesn't always fix everything. Your engine had a problem with the fuel code causing damage to the injectors if it wasn't updated. Around 2005 or 6 at Cummins, we were updating every 870 that came in because the calibrations were shutting off all the fuel when you went down a hill with no throttle or the jakes were on. So if you went down Fancy Gap with the jakes on all the way and never touched the throttle, by the time you got to the bottom, you could have had scuffed injectors. Then you have general low power until you replace the injectors. So the calibration update would fix that. They called it, the calibration update went something on the order of corrects fueling issue when motoring. And motoring is when you're coasting. So it would go from no fuel to the injectors to just a tiny percentage, enough to keep those plungers lubricated so they wouldn't get scuffed. That's probably all fixed. I just mentioned it because you have an 870. I certainly wouldn't lose a wink of sleep over it. Of course, I'm assuming you have no active fault codes and no fuel leaks anywhere, and you don't have any problem with fuel restriction. And I don't think you have those things, but it was worth mentioning. So let's go and take a look at the slides, and then you can decide what you think you need to do to fix that problem. So here's that tool I mentioned that you use to check for air, and you take the metering actuator off and you bolt that tool to the IFSM with the O-rings on the back of it, or gasket, whatever you have. Put that hose on, put it in a cup of water, unplug the ECM, spin the engine over for about 15 seconds, and if no bubbles come out of the hose in the water, you're good. Then you'd put the metering actuator back on and do the other bank. And if you have bubbles, then you have to bar the engine over. And what you're looking for is this ball check on the injector. On the left where it says OK, this is down on the bottom tip, right above where they seat in the bottom of the head before you're in the cylinder. And where it says OK, that's a stainless steel machined piece of stainless steel ring or housing, and that ball check's a hole drilled in it. And imagine they put a stainless steel dowel rod in it and then surface ground it smooth. So you can barely see that circle around it when it's new. On the right, you can easily see where there was something there that's gone, the little plug, or it's laying down in. If you see that, that's a failed ball check, and you will have those air bubbles in your cup of water when you do the test. And then, of course, any jet injectors that fail that test have to be replaced. This is the chart that you use when you're doing the test. So up on the top, we have cylinder 1, 2, and 3 on top, 4, 5, and 6 on the bottom. So up on top, you take the front actuator off, you spin the engine over, you see bubbles, you take your ratchet and you start barring the engine over slowly. As soon as you see a bubble come out of the hose, you stop and you look at the mark on the cover where you set your timing. And if, let's say, A is past the mark and B is coming up, then you would choose the injector that correlates to that and replace it because the ball checks failed. This next slide here is just to show you which actuators are meeting, which are timing, because they look alike. You cannot bolt timing and metering in each other's positions because there's one hole that is just off enough you can't get the bolt started in. Obviously the front metering right next to it is the front timing are for cylinder 1, 2, and 3 and are closest to the front of the engine by the radiator. This last slide is how you check the timing actuator. So in this picture, the rear metering and rear timing actuator unplugged and the ECM's plugged in so the engine can run. The engine's going to run on the front 3 cylinders. You've got to set your idle RPM at 800 RPM. It will be able to maintain that with the front 3 cylinders. And then you let the hose run into a bucket. Once the engine's running, you slide the hose into the graduated container, and exactly 10 seconds from then, you pull the hose out and you measure your fluid. And if you have more than 8.7 ounces, the timing actuator that's plugged in has failed. And then you just plug in the back actuators and unplug the front ones, and then repeat the same test over, and now you're checking the other timing actuator. And that's the only way to check the timing actuator. If it's returning too much fuel, it's not timing the injector exactly correctly. At idle, you're metering a very small amount of fuel. Timing's got to be very close. So if any of that's off a little bit on the old 870, it's not hard to get an engine that goes into a Lope idle. Is it a problem? It's nothing I would lose sleep over, as long as when you touch the throttle it runs good and it runs good down the road. You have to decide if it's bothers you enough that you want to spend the time and money to get it sorted out. So very rarely, and I mean rarely, does the ECM cause this problem. If you've got a very, very early calibration like 00 or 11 revision, sometimes updating to the current, which could be .15, .20, .22, might solve that problem. They did a lot of work on what they called the idle algorithm on those engines with the mechanical injectors because they were just a bugger to get them to run smooth if everything didn't just meter perfectly. So, from what you tell me, the engine's probably in good shape, probably runs good. You just got a problem with the lope and the idle. And let us know what you decide to do and how you make out. Thanks for watching Engine Shop Joe. See you next time.